The uniform hung in my closet like a ghost, pressed, decorated, untouched for 3 months. I stared at it while tying my black apron around my waist, the fabric rough against my palms from countless shifts at Milano's restaurant. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was dressing to serve people who wouldn't serve me a glass of water if I were dying of thirst. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My phone buzzed against the nightstand. A text from my supervisor, Danny. Big event tonight, Martinez, VIP wedding party. Be on your A game. I almost laughed. If only he knew what my A game actually looked like. The invitation had arrived 2 weeks ago, addressed to Sofia Martinez, not Colonel Sofia Rivera, not the woman who'd spent the last 15 years climbing through the ranks of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Just Sofia Martinez, the poor cousin who cleaned tables and lived in a studio apartment above the dry cleaner on Maple Street. I'd held that cream-colored cardstock for 20 minutes, reading the elegant script over and over. Isabella Martinez Chen cordially invites you to celebrate her marriage to Captain James Morrison. My cousin Isabella, the golden child who'd never wanted for anything, who'd been handed opportunities like birthday presents while I scraped for every dollar, every chance, every moment of recognition. The last time I'd seen Isabella was at our grandmother's funeral 4 years ago. She'd worn designer black, complete with pearl earrings that cost more than my monthly rent. I'd worn my dress uniform, the only formal attire I owned that fit properly. Isabella had glanced at me once, a look that said she remembered I existed but wished I didn't. Still playing soldier, I see, she'd whispered to our Aunt Carmen, loud enough for me to hear. Some people never grow out of their fantasies. I'd said nothing then. I'd learned early that responding to Isabella only gave her more ammunition. Better to stay quiet, invisible, forgettable. That's what the Martinez family preferred anyway. Growing up, Isabella and I had been inseparable every summer. Her parents would drop her off at our cramped duplex in East Phoenix, while they traveled to Europe or the Hamptons. She'd complain about the heat, the small rooms, the way our neighbors spoke Spanish too loudly. But she'd still beg to stay longer when August ended, tears streaming down her face as her mother loaded her Louis Vuitton luggage into their Mercedes. "Promise you'll visit," she'd always say, gripping my hand. "Promise we'll stay best friends forever." I'd promise, of course. I was 8, then 9, then 10. I believed in forever. I believed in cousins who meant what they said. But the visits never happened. My mother worked double shifts at the hospital, first as a janitor, then as a nurse's aide. My father drove trucks cross-country, home maybe 10 days a month if we were lucky. There was no money for trips to Isabella's world in North Scottsdale, where houses had pools and maids and refrigerators that dispensed ice from the door. Instead, I learned to cook dinner for myself by age 11. I learned to forge my father's signature on permission slips. I learned to budget grocery money and explain to teachers why I couldn't afford field trip fees. Isabella learned to play tennis and speak French and wear clothes that cost more than our monthly food budget. The divergence wasn't sudden. It was gradual, like watching someone drift away on a boat while you stood on the shore. Phone calls became shorter, less frequent. Christmas cards arrived with generic messages. "Hope you're well," written in handwriting that looked like it belonged on wedding invitations. By high school, Isabella had stopped calling altogether. I heard about her life through my mother, who heard it from Aunt Carmen, who heard it directly from Isabella's mother during their monthly phone calls. Isabella was captain of the debate team. Isabella got into Stanford. Isabella was dating a boy whose father owned half of Phoenix. I was working nights at a 24-hour diner to help my mother pay rent. I was studying for AP exams by streetlight because our electricity got shut off. I was applying for every scholarship, every grant, every program that might lift me out of the gravity well of East Phoenix. The Army recruiter found me during lunch period my senior year. Staff Sergeant Williams was a compact woman with kind eyes and a firm handshake. She didn't promise me glory or adventure. She promised me structure, education, and a chance to build something bigger than myself. "You've got the grades," she said, scanning my transcript. "You've got the drive. What you need is opportunity." I signed the papers 3 days after graduation. My parents cried, but they understood. The Army meant college money. It meant health insurance. It meant I wouldn't end up like them, scraping for every dollar and falling short every month. Isabella sent a graduation card with a $20 bill inside. The note read, "Heard you're joining the military. How exciting. Stay safe. XOXO, Bella." $20. I'd kept that bill in my wallet for 2 years, not because I treasured it, but because it reminded me of exactly how little my life meant to her. Basic training was hell. Officer candidate school was worse, but I thrived on the structure, the clear expectations, the merit-based advancement. For the first time in my life, my background didn't matter. My family's bank account didn't matter. Only my performance, my dedication, my ability to lead others through impossible situations. I deployed to Afghanistan twice, spent 14 months in Iraq, managed reconstruction projects that brought clean water to villages that had never had running plumbing. I earned my degree in civil engineering through night classes and weekend seminars. I was promoted ahead of schedule, twice. Colonel Rivera. It still sounded strange when people said it, like a title that belonged to someone else. Someone who'd grown up with advantages, with connections, with a family that expected success instead of fearing it. But here I was, tying an apron around my waist, getting ready to serve dinner to my cousin's wedding guests. Because somewhere between becoming an officer and building my career, I'd also remained Sofia Martinez, the girl who needed a second job to afford her studio apartment. The woman who couldn't risk her family discovering that their poor relative had actually made something of herself. Not because I was ashamed of my success, because I knew what they'd do with it. They'd claim it, they'd rewrite history. They'd suddenly remember all the times they'd supported me, all the encouragement they'd given. They'd find ways to make my achievements about them, their family, their guidance. I'd stayed hidden because being invisible was safer than being used. The wedding was at the Phoenician resort, naturally. The kind of place Isabella had always belonged, where valets wore white gloves and the flower arrangements cost more than most people's monthly salary. I'd worked events there before, anonymous in my black uniform, professional and efficient. Tonight would be different, though. Tonight I'd serve champagne to people who'd never bothered to learn my real name. I'd clear plates from tables where my own family sat, pretending I was just another face in the service staff. The invitation lay on my dresser, mocking me with its elegant font and expensive paper. Isabella Martinez Chen. She'd hyphenated her name, of course, keeping the Martinez to maintain her connection to our grandmother's inheritance, adding the Chen to signal her arrival in Phoenix high society. I picked up the invitation one more time, running my thumb across the embossed lettering. Part of me wondered what would happen if I showed up as Colonel Rivera instead of Sofia Martinez. If I walked into that ballroom in my dress uniform, medals catching the light, showing them exactly who I'd become without their help or approval. But I already knew what would happen. They'd find a way to diminish it, to make it about them, to turn my success into their story. Better to remain invisible. Better to serve their champagne and collect my paycheck and go home to my quiet life. I folded the invitation in half and dropped it in the trash. Tonight, I was just the waitress. Nothing more, nothing less. At least, that was the plan. The first time someone called me ma'am, with genuine respect, I almost cried. It was at Fort Leonard Wood, 3 months into my officer training. I'd just completed a grueling field exercise, leading my squad through a simulated combat scenario in the Missouri mud. My uniform was soaked, my boots caked with clay, and my voice was hoarse from shouting commands. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hawkins approached me as I was checking equipment with my team. She was a legend in the Corps of Engineers, a woman who'd built bridges in Kuwait and restored power grids in Somalia. When she stopped in front of me, I snapped to attention, expecting criticism. "Outstanding leadership out there, Second Lieutenant Rivera," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from 20 years of command. "Your squad executed that operation flawlessly because you prepared them properly. That's what good officers do." She walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing in the mud with something I'd never felt before, not just pride, but recognition. Someone had seen my work, evaluated it on its merit, and found it excellent. Back home in Phoenix, recognition came with conditions. Good grades meant you were getting too big for your britches. Success meant you were forgetting where you came from. Ambition was something to be suspicious of, especially in women, especially in girls from our neighborhood. But the army was different. Here, excellence was expected, rewarded, celebrated. The more I achieved, the more responsibility they gave me. It was intoxicating after a lifetime of being told to stay small. My first deployment to Afghanistan came 18 months later. I was a newly minted first lieutenant, assigned to a forward operating base in Kandahar province. My job was to oversee the construction of a water treatment facility for a village that had been drinking contaminated well water for decades. The project was supposed to take 6 months. It took 14 thanks to supply delays, equipment failures, and 3 separate attacks on our convoy routes. But we finished it. I watched village children drink clean water for the first time in their lives, and I knew I'd found my calling. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. That's when the letters from home stopped coming altogether. My mother had been writing weekly since I'd enlisted, filling me in on neighborhood gossip and family news. She'd mention Isabella occasionally, usually something about college or her internship at her stepfather's law firm. But after my first successful deployment, the letters became shorter, less frequent, then stopped entirely. I called home during my mid-tour leave. My mother answered on the 8th ring, her voice distant and formal. "Sophia? Oh, hello. We weren't expecting to hear from you. I wrote to you about my leave dates, Mama. I'm calling from Germany." "Germany?" A pause. "Why are you in Germany?" I explained about the layover, about flying commercial back to Phoenix, about wanting to spend 2 weeks at home before my next assignment. There was silence on the other end of the line. "Your cousin Isabella is getting engaged," she said finally, "to a wonderful young man, a lawyer, like her." "That's great, Mama. I'm happy for her. She's doing very well for herself, very successful, not like," she trailed off, but I heard the unfinished sentence. "Not like you, playing soldier in the desert." I spent my leave alone in my childhood bedroom, sleeping on a twin mattress that felt too small for the person I'd become. My father was on a long haul to Seattle. My mother worked double shifts, or claimed to. Isabella never called, never visited, never acknowledged that I was home. The rejection might have broken me if it hadn't been for Captain Marcus Webb. I met him during my second deployment, this time to Iraq. He was a logistics officer from Alabama, soft-spoken and methodical, with the kind of steady presence that made chaos feel manageable. We worked together on a massive infrastructure project, rebuilding the electrical grid for a city of 200,000 people. The work was dangerous, complicated, and utterly necessary. Marcus had a gift for seeing the big picture while managing every detail, and he taught me to do the same. "Engineering isn't just about building things," he told me one evening as we reviewed blueprints by Generator Light. "It's about solving problems that affect real people's lives. Every wire we string, every pipe we lay, every road we pave, that's someone's future we're building." I fell in love with him over spreadsheets and supply manifests. He fell in love with me, he said later, watching me argue with contractors in broken Arabic, refusing to accept substandard materials that might fail and hurt civilians. We got married during a brief stateside assignment, a simple ceremony at the courthouse in Killeen, Texas. My parents didn't come. They'd met Marcus once, during a stilted dinner where my mother served tamales from a box and my father mostly watched television. Marcus had tried to make conversation about my work, my accomplishments, my future plans. My parents had responded with polite nods and quick subject changes. "They don't understand what you do," Marcus said later, as we drove back to our hotel. "They don't understand how important you are." "They understand," I replied. "They just don't like it." Isabella sent a wedding gift, a crystal picture frame from Williams-Sonoma with no picture inside. The card read, "Wishing you happiness, XOXO, Bella and James, James." The lawyer fiancé she'd never bothered to introduce to the family. I wondered if he knew she had cousins in East Phoenix, or if she'd edited that part of her history. My promotion to captain came with an assignment to Fort Bragg, overseeing military construction projects across the Southeast. For the first time in my career, I was managing multi-million-dollar budgets and supervising teams of engineers, contractors, and military personnel. The work was everything I'd trained for: complex, challenging, meaningful. We built training facilities, upgraded barracks, designed infrastructure that would support military operations for decades. I was good at it, better than good. My efficiency reports reflected that, and my superiors took notice. But success in the Army meant longer deployments, more responsibility, less time for personal relationships. Marcus and I grew apart slowly, the way couples do when careers pull them in different directions. He wanted stability, a house with a white picket fence, children who could count on their parents being home for dinner. I wanted to build airports in Afghanistan and power plants in Iraq. I wanted to lead reconstruction efforts that changed entire regions. I wanted to matter on a scale bigger than any suburban dream. Our divorce was as quiet as our marriage had been. No drama, no bitterness, just two people acknowledging that they'd grown into incompatible futures. Marcus took a job with a defense contractor in Virginia. I took a promotion to major and deployed to Syria. The Syria deployment changed everything. I was assigned to lead a joint task force rebuilding critical infrastructure in territory recently reclaimed from insurgents. Schools, hospitals, roads, power grids. Everything needed to be built from scratch while managing security threats, political complications, and equipment shortages. It was the kind of assignment that broke careers or made them. I was determined it would make mine. 18 months later, we'd restored power to 4 cities, rebuilt 12 schools, and constructed a regional hospital that served 300,000 people. The project came in under budget and ahead of schedule, despite 3 rocket attacks and a supply chain nightmare that would have defeated a less determined team. The promotion to lieutenant colonel came with a ceremony at the Pentagon. I stood in my dress blues, surrounded by senior officers and Pentagon officials, as a 2-star general pinned the silver oak leaves to my collar. "Colonel Rivera," he said, using my new rank for the first time, "you've demonstrated exceptional leadership under the most challenging circumstances. The Army is fortunate to have officers of your caliber." I thought about calling my parents to share the news. I thought about sending Isabella a photo. Instead, I went to dinner alone at a quiet restaurant in Arlington, toasting my success with a glass of wine and the satisfaction of knowing I'd earned every thread of those silver leaves. The calls from home had stopped completely by then. Not just the letters, the phone calls, the birthday cards, even the obligatory Christmas greetings. It was as if Sofia Martinez had simply vanished, erased from the family narrative. And perhaps that was for the best. Colonel Rivera was someone I'd built from scratch, someone who belonged entirely to me. She owed nothing to East Phoenix, or the Martinez family legacy of small dreams and smaller expectations. But late at night, in officer quarters that felt more like home than anywhere I'd grown up, I still wondered what it would feel like to have a family that celebrated my success instead of resenting it. To have people who knew my story and felt proud to tell it. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I'd chosen my path and accepted its costs. But when Isabella's wedding invitation arrived, addressed to Sofia Martinez at an address I hadn't lived at in 5 years, I realized how completely I'd been erased from their world. And how completely I'd allowed it to happen. The Milano's restaurant staff meeting happened every Friday at 2 p.m. in the cramped office behind the kitchen. Danny Castellanos, our floor manager, sat behind a desk covered in invoices and scheduling sheets, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose like he was trying to look more important than he actually was. "Saturday night's the big one," he announced to the 8 of us crammed into the space. "VIP wedding reception at the Phoenician. 300 guests, full service, and they're paying premium rates for perfection." Maria Gonzalez raised her hand. She'd been waiting tables longer than I'd been alive, her movements efficient and precise, despite arthritic fingers that sometimes trembled when she carried heavy trays. "What's the uniform situation?" she asked. "Full formal or standard black?" "Full formal," Danny replied. "Black slacks, white shirts, black bow ties for everyone. Hair pulled back, minimal jewelry, no visible tattoos. This isn't some corporate lunch. These people expect invisible service." Invisible service. The phrase stung more than it should have. I'd spent 15 years being anything but invisible, commanding respect from generals and defense contractors, managing budgets that exceeded entire city revenues. But here, invisibility was the goal. Sophia, you're on the early shift, Danny continued, consulting his clipboard. 5 p.m. arrival for setup. You'll be working the cocktail hour and the main reception. Table assignments will be posted tomorrow morning. I nodded, already calculating logistics in my head. The Phoenician was a 40-minute drive from my apartment. I'd need to leave by 4:15 to account for Saturday evening traffic, which meant finishing my morning shift at the office supply warehouse by 2 p.m. It would be tight but manageable. After the meeting, I stayed behind to review the event details. The client information sheet listed the happy couple as Isabella Martinez Chen and Captain James Morrison, U.S. Army. My blood went cold. Captain Morrison, Army. I stared at the paper, reading the name over and over. It couldn't be a coincidence. Phoenix had a significant military population, but the timing, the connection to Isabella, it had to be more than chance. That evening, I sat in my studio apartment with my laptop, researching Captain James Morrison. It didn't take long to find him. His service record was partially public. West Point graduate, class of 2018, currently stationed at Fort Huachuca in Arizona. Intelligence officer, clean record, fast-track promotion timeline. His engagement photo with Isabella appeared in the Phoenix Business Journal's Society pages from 6 months ago. She looked radiant in a designer dress, her smile perfect for the camera. He looked uncomfortable but handsome in his dress uniform, standing stiffly beside her like he wasn't sure he belonged in the frame. I recognized something in his expression, the careful posture of someone trying to prove they deserve to be there. It was the same look I'd worn for years before I learned to command rooms instead of just occupying them. Saturday morning arrived gray and overcast, unusual for Phoenix in October. I worked my warehouse shift in a fog, moving boxes and updating inventory spreadsheets, while my mind churned through possibilities. What were the chances that Isabella had chosen to marry an Army officer? What were the chances that he might know of me, or my work, or my reputation? Military communities were smaller than civilians realized. Officers talked, especially about successful female commanders. Colonel Rivera wasn't exactly a household name, but within engineering circles, within reconstruction command structures, my work had gained attention. I told myself it didn't matter. I was Sofia Martinez tonight, not Colonel Rivera. I was hired to help. Background scenery, someone whose face would be forgotten before the champagne glasses were cleared. But as I drove toward Scottsdale, my hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The Phoenician resort sprawled across 250 acres of desert landscape, its Mediterranean architecture gleaming white against the Camelback Mountains. I'd driven past it countless times, usually on my way to work other events at smaller venues. Tonight, I was actually going inside. The employee entrance was around back, naturally. A security guard checked my ID against a list, handed me a temporary badge, and directed me toward the service corridors. The contrast was immediate. While the guest areas featured marble floors and crystal chandeliers, the staff areas were utilitarian concrete and fluorescent lighting. The catering office buzzed with controlled chaos. 20 servers, 4 bartenders, and a handful of kitchen staff received final instructions from the event coordinator, a sharp-dressed woman named Patricia who spoke in the clipped tones of someone accustomed to making split-second decisions. Table assignments are posted on the board, she announced. Cocktail service begins at 6. Dinner service starts at 7:30 sharp. Questions? I found my name on the list, tables 12 to 18, northeast section of the ballroom. The assignment sheet included a small diagram showing table locations. I was working the furthest section from the head table, the area typically reserved for distant relatives and business associates. Perfect. I could do my job, collect my paycheck, and avoid any awkward family encounters. The uniform fitting room was a converted storage closet with a cracked mirror and harsh overhead lighting. I changed into the required outfit. Black slacks that fit well enough, a crisp white shirt that actually looked professional, and a black bow tie that took 3 attempts to get straight. Looking at myself in the mirror, I felt a strange disconnect. The woman staring back at me looked competent, professional, but entirely unremarkable. Just another server in a sea of staff uniforms. I pulled my hair back into a low bun, applied minimal makeup, and added the temporary name tag, Sophia M. Even my last name was abbreviated, reduced to a single letter like an afterthought. The ballroom was magnificent. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over cream-colored linens and elaborate floral centerpieces. Each table setting included multiple courses of silverware, 3 glasses, and place cards written in gold calligraphy. The head table sat elevated on a small platform, draped in white silk and flanked by towering arrangements of white roses and baby's breath. I began my setup routine, checking water glasses, adjusting silverware, ensuring napkins were folded precisely. The work was mindless but soothing. There was something comforting about clear, simple tasks after years of managing complex projects with dozens of variables. Other servers moved around me with practiced efficiency. Most of them were career hospitality workers, people who'd perfected the art of professional invisibility. They chatted quietly as they worked, sharing gossip about previous events and difficult customers. "The bride's family is loaded," whispered Marcus, a server who'd worked the venue longer than anyone else. "Martinez's money goes back 3 generations. Real estate, construction, some political connections." "What about the groom?" asked Jennifer, a college student working weekends to pay tuition. "Military guy. Good looking, but you can tell he's nervous about all this." Marcus gestured toward the elaborate decorations. "Probably never seen this kind of money before." I kept my expression neutral, but my mind raced. The Martinez family money that Marcus mentioned, I'd never seen evidence of it growing up. My Aunt Carmen had married well, apparently well enough to afford a wedding at the Phoenician. But that wealth had never trickled down to our side of the family tree. The first guests began arriving at 6. I stationed myself near my assigned section, tray in hand, ready to offer champagne and hors d'oeuvre to whoever needed service. The crowd was exactly what I'd expected. Well-dressed professionals, military officers in formal uniforms, and Phoenix society types who carried themselves like they owned the world. I recognized some faces from newspaper social pages and business journals. City council members, bank executives, the kind of people who attended charity galas and ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Isabella had certainly married into the right crowd. Then I saw my Aunt Carmen. She looked older than I remembered, her hair completely gray now, but she still carried herself with the imperious posture of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She wore a navy blue dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and jewelry that caught the light like small stars. She walked past me without a glance, deep in conversation with a woman I didn't recognize. They were discussing wedding details, the success of the decorations, the quality of the champagne. I was 3 feet away, invisible in my server's uniform. My mother appeared a few minutes later, looking uncomfortable in formal attire that clearly didn't belong to her regular wardrobe. She'd gained weight since I'd last seen her, and her makeup was applied with the careful precision of someone who rarely wore it. She kept glancing around nervously, like she was afraid of being discovered as an imposter. I wanted to go to her, to say hello, to bridge the gap that had grown between us over the years. But I couldn't break character. Not here, not now, not when maintaining my cover was the only thing keeping this situation manageable. The bride arrived at 6:30, making her grand entrance in a dress that probably cost more than most people's cars. Isabella looked stunning, her dark hair swept into an elaborate updo, her makeup flawless, her smile radiant for the photographers documenting every moment. Behind her walked Captain James Morrison in his dress blues. From across the room, he looked exactly like his photos. Tall, broad-shouldered, handsome in the way that made uniform regulations look like fashion choices. His medals and ribbons were perfectly arranged, his posture impeccable. But something in his expression caught my attention. While Isabella basked in the attention, posing for photos and accepting congratulations, Captain Morrison looked slightly overwhelmed. His smile seemed forced, his movements careful, like he was performing a role he hadn't quite mastered. I recognized that look. I'd worn it myself at countless military functions, that careful mask of someone trying to prove they belonged while never quite believing it themselves. The receiving line formed near the entrance, and I watched from my position as guests offered congratulations to the happy couple. Military personnel snapped to attention when greeting Captain Morrison, offering crisp salutes that he returned with practiced precision. Isabella glowed beside him, clearly enjoying her proximity to military protocol and tradition. She'd always loved being the center of attention, and tonight she had an audience worthy of her ambitions. I checked my watch. 7 o'clock. The cocktail hour was nearly over, and dinner service would begin soon. I'd successfully navigated the first hour without incident, maintaining my anonymity while observing the circus from the margins. But as I turned to refresh my champagne tray, I caught Captain Morrison looking in my direction. Our eyes met across the crowded ballroom for just a moment before he turned back to his conversation. It was probably nothing, a random glance, a momentary distraction, but something in his expression suggested recognition, like he was trying to place a familiar face in an unexpected context. I told myself I was being paranoid. There was no way he could recognize me from this distance, in this uniform, in this context. I was just another server, forgettable and invisible. But as I headed toward the kitchen to prepare for dinner service, I couldn't shake the feeling that my carefully constructed anonymity might be more fragile than I'd hoped. Dinner service began like clockwork. The guests filed into the ballroom as servers efficiently cleared cocktail glasses and refreshed table settings. I moved through my assigned section with practiced precision, filling water glasses and ensuring bread plates were properly positioned before the first course arrived. Table 15 was particularly demanding, a group of Phoenix business executives and their wives who treated service staff like they were part of the furniture. They spoke loudly about real estate deals and golf handicaps, occasionally snapping their fingers when they needed something, never making eye contact or saying please. "More wine," barked a man in an expensive suit, holding up his empty glass without looking at me. His wife was deep in conversation about their upcoming trip to Napa Valley, complaining about how difficult it was to get reservations at the restaurant she wanted. I refilled their glasses silently, efficiently, invisibly, just another uniformed figure moving through their evening, unworthy of acknowledgement or basic courtesy. Table 16 was different. An older military couple, probably retired officers based on their posture and the way they spoke to each other. They thanked me when I served their salads, asked how long I'd been working at the venue, treated me like a human being rather than a service mechanism. "Beautiful wedding," the woman said as I topped off her water glass. Though I always worry about these young military marriages. So much pressure, so many expectations. Her husband nodded gravely. Different world from when we were starting out. Social media, family money, career demands. Hard enough without adding all that complexity. I wanted to engage, to share my thoughts about military relationships and the challenges they faced. But Sofia Martinez, the server, had no expertise in such matters, so I simply smiled and moved on to the next table. The head table commanded the center of attention, naturally. Isabella held court like a queen, her laugh carrying across the ballroom whenever someone told an amusing story. She'd changed into a second dress for dinner, this one even more elaborate than her ceremony gown, with beadwork that caught the light every time she moved. Captain Morrison sat beside her, looking increasingly uncomfortable as the evening progressed. He responded politely to conversations but seemed distracted, his gaze occasionally drifting around the room. Several times I caught him looking toward my section, though I told myself it was probably just a coincidence. The toasts began during the main course. Isabella's father stood first, a distinguished-looking man I didn't recognize from family gatherings. He spoke eloquently about love, commitment, and the bright future ahead for the happy couple. His remarks were warm but generic, the kind of speech that could have been delivered at any wedding. Then came Isabella's maid of honor, her best friend from Stanford, whose name I'd heard mentioned in family phone calls over the years. She shared stories about their college adventures, their shared dreams, their unshakable friendship. The audience laughed at appropriate moments, dabbed eyes during sentimental passages. I continued serving, moving efficiently between tables, ensuring wine glasses stayed full and dinner plates were cleared promptly. The kitchen staff was running behind schedule, which meant longer gaps between courses and more time for speeches. That's when my Aunt Carmen stood up. She hadn't been scheduled to speak, based on the program I'd glimpsed earlier, but she commanded attention effortlessly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "If I may," she began, holding her champagne flute like a scepter, "I'd like to say a few words about family, about tradition, and about the importance of choosing the right path in life." The room quieted. Isabella beamed, clearly delighted by the unexpected attention. Captain Morrison straightened in his chair, preparing to receive whatever wisdom was about to be shared. "Isabella has always been special," Carmen continued. "Even as a child, she possessed the grace, intelligence, and ambition that marked her for great things. She made excellent choices in her education, her career, her associations. She understood that success requires not just talent, but wisdom about the people you surround yourself with." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the audience. I continued clearing plates, trying to remain invisible as I worked closer to the head table. "Some people in our family have made different choices," Carmen said, her tone shifting slightly. "They've chosen paths that led away from stability, away from respectability, away from the values that built this family's reputation." My hands trembled slightly as I reached for an empty wine bottle. She couldn't be talking about me. I was nobody to these people, a forgotten relative who'd disappeared into military service years ago. "Take my niece, for example," Carmen continued, and my blood turned to ice. "Sofia Martinez, Isabella's cousin, a girl who grew up with every advantage we could provide, who received love and support from this family." Isabella's smile faltered slightly. She glanced around the room as if searching for someone, but her eyes skipped right over me in my server's uniform. But instead of choosing stability, instead of building a life of substance, Sofia decided to play soldier. She joined the military straight out of high school, abandoning her family and her responsibilities. The room was completely silent now. Even the kitchen noise seemed muted, as if the entire venue was holding its breath. We tried to maintain contact, of course. We invited her to family gatherings, included her in our celebrations. But military life changes people. It makes them hard, unfeminine. It fills their heads with ideas about independence and self-reliance that simply aren't healthy for young women. I stood frozen beside table 14, a stack of empty plates in my hands, listening to my aunt rewrite the entire history of my relationship with this family. The last we heard, she was stationed somewhere overseas, still playing at being a soldier at an age when she should be thinking about marriage and children. It's tragic, really. All that potential wasted on masculine pursuits. Carmen paused for effect, scanning the room with the satisfied expression of someone delivering a particularly insightful observation. "Which is why," she continued, "I'm so proud of Isabella for choosing differently. For understanding that true fulfillment comes from supporting a good man, from building a family, from contributing to society in ways that honor our feminine nature." The applause was polite but uncomfortable. Several guests looked around awkwardly, unsure how to respond to what was clearly a personal attack disguised as wedding wisdom. Isabella recovered her composure quickly, raising her glass in acknowledgement of the toast. But I caught a flicker of something in her expression. Embarrassment, maybe, or recognition that her aunt had crossed a line. Captain Morrison didn't applaud. He sat perfectly still, his face unreadable, his eyes now fixed directly on me across the crowded ballroom. "So let's toast," Carmen concluded, "to Isabella's wisdom in choosing love over career, family over selfish ambition, traditional values over modern confusion. May her marriage be everything that my poor niece's life is not." The room erupted in half-hearted applause and uncomfortable laughter. Glasses clinked, conversations resumed, and the moment passed into wedding folklore. But I remained frozen, plates clutched against my chest, feeling like every eye in the room was suddenly aware of my presence. The invisible server had been made visible in the worst possible way, not as Colonel Rivera, decorated officer and accomplished engineer, but as Sofia Martinez, the family failure whose life served as a cautionary tale. My aunt had weaponized my absence, turning my military service into evidence of poor judgment, my independence into proof of unwomanly ambition. She'd erased my achievements, my rank, my contributions, reducing 15 years of dedicated service to playing soldier. And she'd done it all while I stood 3 feet away, invisible in my server's uniform, unable to defend myself without destroying the careful anonymity I'd worked so hard to maintain. I set the plates down carefully, my hands somehow steady despite the rage building in my chest. Around me, dinner service continued. Guests chatted about business deals and vacation plans. The wedding celebration moved forward without missing a beat. But something fundamental had shifted. The careful balance I'd maintained between my two identities, Colonel Rivera and Sofia Martinez, had been shattered by a woman who knew nothing about my actual life or achievements. I'd been erased, dismissed, and publicly humiliated by people who had no idea who I really was. The question now was whether I was going to let them continue believing their version of my story, or whether it was time for Colonel Rivera to finally make an appearance. The dessert course arrived at 9:30 p.m., an elaborate display of wedding cake and chocolate sculptures that required careful presentation. I moved through the motions mechanically, serving tiramisu to table 15, while my mind churned through 15 years of decisions that had led me to this moment. The businessman who'd been snapping his fingers earlier was now deep in his fourth glass of wine, loudly explaining to his table companions why women weren't suited for military leadership. His wife nodded along, occasionally adding comments about how unfortunate it was when girls rejected their natural roles. "It's biological," he declared, gesturing expansively with his dessert fork. "Women are nurturers, caretakers, put them in combat situations and they fall apart. That's just scientific fact." I set down his tiramisu with perhaps more force than necessary. The plate clinked against the table, causing him to look up briefly before returning to his lecture. To him, I was just a clumsy server. To me, he was living proof of the ignorance I'd spent my career dismantling. At table 16, the retired military couple was having a very different conversation. The woman was speaking quietly to her husband about their daughter, who was currently deployed with the Air Force in Qatar. "I worry about her constantly," she admitted, "not because she can't handle herself. She's tougher than half the men in her squadron, but because of the attitudes she faces every single day." Her husband reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "Sarah's making a difference over there. Those logistics operations she's running are keeping thousands of people supplied and safe. That matters more than what some dinosaurs think about women in uniform." I wanted to tell them about my daughter, metaphorically speaking, all the young female officers I'd mentored over the years. The brilliant engineer who designed water systems for refugee camps. The logistics specialist who'd coordinated supply chains across 3 countries. The combat engineer who'd defused bombs with steadier hands than any of her male colleagues. But Sofia Martinez had no such stories to tell. The cake-cutting ceremony began as I finished serving dessert. Isabella and Captain Morrison stood before an elaborate 3-tiered creation, posing for photographers while guests gathered around with champagne glasses raised. The tradition played out exactly as expected. The sweet feeding of cake to each other, the appreciative laughter from the audience. But I noticed something others probably missed. Captain Morrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. He went through the motions with military precision, but there was something hollow about his performance. Like he was executing a mission rather than celebrating a marriage. Isabella, by contrast, glowed with satisfaction. She'd achieved everything she'd set out to accomplish. A military husband with officer credentials, a society wedding that would be featured in multiple publications, and validation from the family patriarchy that she'd chosen the correct path. The dancing began shortly after. A live band played classical wedding standards while couples swayed across the polished floor. Isabella and Captain Morrison had their first dance to "At Last," her white dress billowing around them like clouds. I retreated to the kitchen area to help with final cleanup duties. The other servers were discussing their weekend plans, comparing tips from different tables, sharing gossip about difficult guests. Normal conversation from people living normal lives, unburdened by the weight of hidden identities. "That speech from the bride's aunt was something else," commented Jennifer, the college student. "Did you hear her going on about some cousin who joined the military? Talk about airing family drama at a wedding." Marcus shook his head disapprovingly. "Rich people have problems. They can't just enjoy the party. They have to make everything about their family politics." "I felt bad for whoever she was talking about," added Maria. "Imagine having your own family talk about you like that in public. And at someone else's wedding, no less." Their sympathy was genuine but misplaced. They pitied Sofia Martinez, the imaginary failure constructed by my aunt's narrative. They had no idea that the actual subject of that humiliation was standing 3 feet away, loading dirty plates into commercial dishwashers. At 10:15 p.m., something shifted. Captain Morrison appeared in the service corridor, looking around uncertainly before approaching our cleanup station. Several servers glanced up nervously. Guests rarely ventured into staff areas, and his formal uniform made him particularly imposing. "Excuse me," he said politely. "I'm looking for Sofia Martinez. I was told she might be working tonight." The kitchen fell silent. Every eye turned toward me, and I felt my carefully constructed invisibility crumbling in real time. Jennifer looked confused, Marcus raised his eyebrows, and Maria studied me with newfound interest. "That's me," I said quietly, setting down the plate I'd been holding. "Is there something you need, sir?" Captain Morrison's expression was unreadable, but his posture remained formally respectful. "Could I speak with you privately for a moment? It's important." The other servers exchanged glances loaded with speculation. Wedding receptions occasionally generated drama, but this was unusual even by their standards. I followed Captain Morrison through the service corridor toward a quiet alcove near the main kitchen. "Colonel Rivera," he said once we were alone, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. The words hit me like a physical blow. My cover wasn't just compromised, it was completely destroyed. After years of successful anonymity, I'd been identified by the one person at this wedding who could recognize both versions of my identity. "I'm sorry," I replied, attempting to maintain the pretense. "I think you have me confused with someone else." Captain Morrison smiled slightly, the first genuine expression I'd seen from him all evening. "Ma'am, with respect, I've studied your work extensively. The Syria Reconstruction Project is required reading at the War College. Your water treatment innovations in Afghanistan are still being implemented across multiple theaters." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle between us. "I know exactly who you are, Colonel Rivera. The question is why you're serving champagne at my wedding instead of commanding engineers in the field." I stared at him for a long moment, watching my carefully maintained facade crumble completely. There was no point in continued denial. He clearly knew too much to be deflected by simple protestations. "How?" I asked finally. "Your posture, initially. Military bearing is hard to hide, even in civilian clothes. But what confirmed it was watching you during the toasts. Specifically, during your aunt's speech." Captain Morrison's expression grew serious. "I've seen that look before, Colonel. It's the same expression I wore for the first 6 months of dating Isabella, when her family made comments about my background, my family's financial situation, my suitability for their social circle." The honesty in his voice surprised me. Here was a successful officer, apparently marrying into Phoenix society's upper echelons, admitting to feelings of inadequacy and family judgment. "They don't know," I said simply, "about my rank, my service record, anything. As far as they're concerned, I'm exactly what my aunt described, a family disappointment who disappeared into military service." "But why?" His question was genuine. Puzzled. "You're one of the most accomplished officers in the Corps of Engineers. You've commanded reconstruction efforts that literally rebuilt entire regions. Why let them believe you're a failure?" I laughed bitterly. "Because I know my family, Captain Morrison. If they discovered that poor Sofia Martinez had become Colonel Rivera, they wouldn't celebrate my success. They'd claim credit for it. They'd rewrite history to make themselves the supportive relatives who always believed in me. And you'd rather be dismissed than used." "Exactly." Quote. Captain Morrison nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his eyes. "I can relate to that more than you might think. Isabella's family has very specific ideas about military service. They like the prestige, the formal uniforms, the social respectability. But they don't actually understand what we do or why it matters." "Is that why you looked so uncomfortable during the ceremony?" "Part of it." He glanced back toward the ballroom, where music and laughter indicated the reception was continuing without him. "It's complicated, marrying someone whose family sees your career as an accessory rather than a calling." We stood in silence for a moment, 2 military officers sharing a recognition that transcended rank and circumstance. He was newly married, apparently successful. embarking on what should be the happiest night of his life. I was working a second job in secret, hiding my achievements from people who should have celebrated them. "What happens now?" I asked. Captain Morrison straightened, his expression becoming more formal. "That depends, Colonel. Do you want to continue being Sofia Martinez, the invisible server? Or are you ready to be Colonel Rivera again?" "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, "that I have the authority to change the narrative. One word from me, and everyone in that ballroom learns exactly who's been serving their champagne tonight." The offer hung between us like a loaded weapon. After years of hiding, of accepting diminishment, of allowing my family to construct a false narrative about my life, I suddenly had the opportunity to reveal the truth. But revelation came with consequences. Once my identity was exposed, there would be no going back to anonymity. The comfortable distance I'd maintained from my family's drama would collapse. They'd want explanations, justifications, and probably attempts to reconcile that would ring hollow after years of indifference. "Why would you do that?" I asked. Captain Morrison smiled again, and this time it reached his eyes. "Because what your aunt said tonight was wrong on every level, and because you deserve better than being erased from your own family's story." He paused, checking his watch. "The reception has about an hour left. If you want to make a statement, now would be the time. But it has to be your choice, Colonel." I looked back toward the ballroom, where my family was celebrating Isabella's triumph while maintaining their fictional version of my failure. For 15 years, I'd let them believe their story because it was easier than fighting for the truth. But standing in that service corridor, still wearing my server's uniform, I realized that some fights were worth having, even if they came 15 years too late. I stared at Captain Morrison for what felt like an eternity, weighing 15 years of careful anonymity against one moment of truth. The sounds of the reception drifted through the service corridor. Laughter, clinking glasses, the band playing "The Way You Look Tonight." "I need 5 minutes," I said finally. "Take all the time you need, Colonel." I walked to the staff restroom and locked the door behind me. The fluorescent lighting was harsh, unforgiving, showing every line of exhaustion on my face. The woman in the mirror looked tired, not just from tonight's shift, but from years of carrying the weight of divided identity. For so long, I'd told myself that hiding was protection, that staying invisible kept me safe from their judgment, their attempts to diminish my achievements, their inevitable efforts to rewrite history. But standing there in my server's uniform, I realized that hiding had become its own form of prison. I reached up and removed the pins holding my hair in its neat service bun. My fingers worked automatically, smoothing the dark waves that fell past my shoulders. It was a small change, but somehow significant. The first step away from Sofia Martinez and back toward Colonel Rivera. When I returned to the corridor, Captain Morrison was waiting exactly where I'd left him. "I've made my decision," I said. "And? I need to do this properly, not as an ambush or a spectacle, but with dignity." I straightened my shoulders, feeling my military bearing reassert itself. "Can you arrange for the microphone during the next break in dancing?" Captain Morrison nodded. "The band usually takes a 15-minute break around 11 p.m. I'll speak with the event coordinator." We walked back toward the ballroom together, but I stopped at the edge of the service area. "Captain Morrison, James?" He turned. "Thank you for seeing me when everyone else looked right through me. Thank you for everything you've done for the Corps, Colonel. It's an honor to finally meet you properly." The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of final service duties. I cleared remaining dessert plates, refilled coffee cups, and helped coordinate the final cleanup with mechanical precision. But my mind was entirely focused on what was coming next. At exactly 11 p.m., the band finished their set and announced a short break. Captain Morrison approached the bandstand and spoke quietly with the event coordinator, who looked surprised but nodded, and handed him the wireless microphone. The ballroom gradually quieted as guests noticed the groom taking the stage. Isabella looked up from her conversation with confusion, clearly not expecting another speech. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Morrison began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to addressing troops. "If I could have your attention for just a moment." The room fell silent. 300 guests turned toward the bandstand, including my family members scattered throughout the ballroom. My mother, my Aunt Carmen, Isabella, all of them focused on my new cousin-in-law. Tonight has been a celebration of love, family, and new beginnings, he continued. But it's also been a reminder that sometimes we don't see the people right in front of us clearly. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the service area, moving toward the center of the ballroom. Several guests glanced at me with mild confusion. Why was a server approaching during a speech? Earlier this evening, we heard comments about a family member who was described as having made poor choices. Someone who, quote, abandoned traditional values for military service. Captain Morrison's voice carried clearly through the sound system. I'd like to introduce you to that person. My Aunt Carmen's face went pale. Isabella's expression shifted from confusion to dawning horror as she began to piece together what was happening. Colonel Sofia Rivera, Captain Morrison announced, United States Army Corps of Engineers, recipient of the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, and the Meritorious Service Medal, commander of reconstruction operations in 3 theaters of combat, builder of infrastructure that has provided clean water, reliable power, and essential services to over 2 million civilians. The ballroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Guests turned to stare at me as I walked steadily toward the front of the room, my server's uniform suddenly seeming like the costume it had always been. Colonel Rivera has spent the last 15 years rebuilding cities, training engineers, and leading some of the most complex infrastructure projects in modern military history. She's been honored by foreign governments, cited by the Pentagon, and recognized by engineering organizations worldwide. I reached the head table where my family sat frozen in various states of shock. My mother's hand covered her mouth. Carmen sat rigidly upright, her face a mask of controlled fury. Isabella stared at me like she was seeing a ghost. Captain Morrison held out the microphone to me. Colonel Rivera, would you like to say a few words? I took the microphone, feeling its familiar weight in my hand. How many briefings had I given to generals and defense contractors? How many presentations to foreign officials and engineering teams? This should have been easy. But looking out at the sea of faces, some curious, some shocked, some calculating, I felt the full weight of this moment. Good evening, I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my chest. As Captain Morrison mentioned, I'm Colonel Sofia Rivera, though most of you knew me as Sofia Martinez. I turned slightly to face my family's table directly. I've spent this evening serving champagne to people who didn't recognize me, listening to conversations about my failures and poor choices, hearing my own aunt describe my military service as, quote, playing soldier. The silence in the ballroom was absolute now. Even the kitchen staff had stopped working to listen. For 15 years, I've commanded engineering units, managed reconstruction budgets exceeding $50 million, and led teams that rebuilt essential infrastructure in war zones. I've been personally commended by 3-star generals and foreign ministers. I paused, letting the words settle over the crowd. Tonight I learned that while I was building airports in Syria and water treatment plants in Afghanistan, my family was building a story about my life that bore no resemblance to reality. The microphone felt powerful in my hands, not as a weapon, but as a tool for reconstruction. It was time to rebuild the truth. The microphone trembled slightly in my hand as I faced the ballroom full of stunned guests. 300 people who had been enjoying champagne and wedding cake were now witnessing a family reckoning 15 years in the making. The woman who spoke earlier about traditional values and proper choices, I continued, my eyes finding Carmen at the head table, described a fictional person, someone who abandoned her family, made poor decisions, wasted her potential on masculine pursuits. Quote. Carmen's face had shifted from pale shock to defensive anger. She started to rise from her chair, but I held up my free hand. That person doesn't exist. The real Sofia Martinez, Colonel Rivera, chose service over comfort, dedication over convenience, and excellence over expectations. I chose to build things that matter instead of playing it safe. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Several military officers in the audience began to sit straighter, recognizing the shift in dynamics. The retired couple from table 16 was nodding approvingly. You want to know about choices? I turned to address the entire room now, my voice growing stronger. I chose to miss family gatherings because I was delivering clean water to villages that had never had it. I chose to skip social events because I was training young engineers to defuse bombs and rebuild schools. Isabella finally found her voice. Sophia, this is my wedding. Yes, it is, I interrupted, turning to face my cousin directly. Your wedding, where your aunt felt comfortable using my life as a cautionary tale. Where my military service was dismissed as playing games. Where 15 years of achievement were erased to make a point about feminine virtue. The business executive from Table 15, the one who'd been lecturing about women's unsuitability for military leadership, was staring at me with obvious discomfort. His wife had gone completely silent. I served 3 combat tours, I continued, my voice carrying across the silent ballroom. I managed teams of male engineers who respected my expertise and followed my orders without question. I briefed generals, coordinated with foreign officials, and solved problems that saved lives. My mother was crying now, though whether from shame or pride I couldn't tell. She kept shaking her head, as if trying to process this collision between the daughter she thought she knew and the woman standing before her. But here's what really matters, I said, my tone softening slightly. I didn't hide my achievements because I was ashamed of them. I hid them because I knew what this family would do with them. Carmen couldn't contain herself any longer. You disappeared. You cut off contact. You never. I stopped calling because every conversation became a lecture about settling down and finding a husband. I stopped visiting because every gathering included comments about my phase and when I'd grow out of it. I stopped sharing my life because none of you wanted to hear about it unless it involved wedding plans. The truth hung in the air like smoke. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, recognizing uncomfortable parallels in their own families. Captain Morrison stepped forward and took the microphone gently from my hands. Ladies and gentlemen, I think this has been educational for all of us. Colonel Rivera is not only an exceptional officer, but clearly an exceptional woman who deserves respect, not revisionist family history. He looked directly at Isabella, his new wife, with an expression that suggested their marriage was going to involve some serious conversations. I think, he continued carefully, that any family would be proud to claim Colonel Rivera as one of their own. The question is whether they're worthy of her. The ballroom remained silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, the retired military couple from Table 16 began to applaud. Other officers joined them. Soon, roughly half the room was clapping. Not the polite wedding applause from earlier, but genuine recognition. Carmen sat frozen, her face a mask of conflicted emotions. Isabella looked mortified, caught between her family's expectations and her new husband's clear disapproval of what had transpired. But my mother stood up. She walked toward me slowly, her face streaked with tears, her formal dress seeming to weigh her down with each step. When she reached me, she stopped, just inches away. "Mija," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I'm so sorry. I was so scared of losing you to that world that I never saw what you were becoming in it." The hug that followed was awkward, tentative, the embrace of two people trying to bridge a 15-year gap in 30 seconds. But it was genuine. As we separated, I noticed the crowd beginning to disperse. Some guests returned to their conversations, processing what they'd witnessed. Others approached to introduce themselves, to thank me for my service, to ask questions about my work. The businessman from Table 15 walked past without making eye contact, his wife trailing behind him. But the retired colonel's wife came over immediately. "My daughter is going to be so inspired when I tell her about tonight," she said warmly. "She's been dealing with some of the same attitudes you described. Thank you for standing up." Isabella approached last, her wedding dress rustling softly as she moved. Her perfect makeup was slightly smudged, her composure finely cracked. "I never knew," she said quietly, "about any of it. The achievements, the recognition, what you'd actually accomplished. You never asked." She flinched at the honesty, but didn't argue. Can we try to fix this? Not tonight, obviously, but someday." I studied her face, looking for sincerity behind the social conditioning. "That depends, Isabella. Do you want to know Colonel Rivera, or are you just trying to manage the family embarrassment?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I want to know my cousin, the real one." "Then call me in a month. Not to apologize or explain, but to actually listen." As the reception slowly returned to its normal rhythm, I found myself standing with Captain Morrison near the edge of the dance floor. The band had resumed playing, though the energy felt different now, less performative, more genuine. "No regrets?" he asked. "None," I replied, surprised by how true that felt. 15 years of hiding just ended tonight. Whatever happens next, at least it'll be honest. Your family might need time to adjust. They'll have time. The question is whether they'll use it to grow or to construct new justifications for old behavior. Captain Morrison smiled. "Speaking of time, I should probably go dance with my wife. We have some things to discuss. Good luck with that conversation." "Thank you, Colonel Rivera, for everything." As he walked away, I realized I was still wearing my server's uniform, but somehow, it no longer felt like a disguise. It was just clothes, temporary, changeable, irrelevant to who I actually was. For the first time in 15 years, Sofia Martinez and Colonel Rivera were the same person. And that person was finally free to be exactly who she'd earned the right to become. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.